I really appreciate the interest. I know it's a bit of an obscure topic, and I know that only 1% of people have autism, but yes, I appreciate that. I always find in these situations when I've done talks like this before, that an amusing but self-deprecating clip is always helpful to start with. You'll have to forgive me if the volume isn't, because I haven't managed to. I'm just going to go quick.
It just flashed up with a thing. Your volume on the iPad itself is quite low.
Oh, was it?
Yeah. Oh, no, it's gone back up now.
Okay. If it doesn't, I can just play the volume from the iPad, but I don't know how loud that will be. No, okay. Okay.
Check the volume on the iPad again, because once it's unplugged, it
Oh,
goes to a
that's
different
true.
volume setting.
Okay, we'll try that, and then if that doesn't work, we can forget the clip for now, but I can send it out if that would be helpful. No, it's not letting me do that, so...
It's picking it up through the HDMI connection that you're data chaining on.
Volume
So
on the TV.
try the volume on the telly.
Yeah.
Where is the volume? Oh, sorry.
Let's try that, so you can blast our ears off.
That's fine. I can send it out, or if someone wants to try and fix it after I finish speaking, then do that. Sorry about that. Okay. In which case. So I'm going to speak for about 15 minutes. I've tried to cut it down, but concisity isn't my best quality, unfortunately. Okay. And then we can have some time for flexible questions. Feel free to leave if you need to, etc. So to begin, I thought we'd start with what is autism? And I'm going to specifically be talking about what used to be called Asperger's syndrome, but that's apparently a politically incorrect term now due to the eugenics history of Asperger. But some places will still, just literally started today. Some places will still, in some countries and particularly Eastern Europe, they'll still diagnose it as Asperger's syndrome. So that's what I'm going to be talking about. It's now called Level 1 autism. It's the type that I have, and it's basically the type where you don't have any speech or movement impediments, but it affects you in more subtle ways. So the type of autism that I have is known as a hidden disability, although arguably, after talking to me for about half an hour, you can kind of see it quite clearly, but it's not it's not visibly present, even if audibly it might be. So that's what I'm going to specifically be talking about. I think it does receive less press coverage than the more severe forms of autism, like level 2 and 3, where speech or movement are impaired to a degree. It's sometimes known as high-functioning autism. Again, that's terms come under a bit of contention because apparently it's disparaging to people that have lower-functioning autism. But when you have to ask someone, what's level 1 autism? It's high-functioning autism. There isn't really a way around that. So that's what we're talking about. So what is it? It's a neurodevelopmental condition that typically starts to manifest itself around 1.5 years of age, and then will kind of develop from there. It's largely genetic in terms of causation. So they've done studies of identical twins, and they found that it's kind of 80% plus genetic. So my father has the condition, his father had it, etc., etc. So what characterises it? How do they diagnose it? I guess is the next question. Well, one of the features, as I'm sure you all noticed, is obsessive and narrow interests. Another one is, over or under sensitivity to light, smell, sound. So personally, I find it quite frustrating, for example, when someone says, should we change the mood in this room, and virtually turns the lights off. Because I'm more sensitive to those kind of things, and loud, high-pitched sounds, I'm more sensitive than the average person would be. So yes, I think another thing is challenges in social interactions. So particularly in large group conversations with things like turn taking and being able to deal with unpredicted interruptions or changes in subject in a conversation, things like that, and adjusting. And also in terms of emotional and social intelligence. I can't really tell you what those things are because I don't really understand them, but I think it's largely to do with subtle social cues and reading facial expressions and reading the room and things like that. And yes, being able to see the kind of 70% or whatever it is of non-verbal communication that goes on between people and body language and things like that. So I think those are the kind of main things, the ways it affects me and the ways it affects people that have high functioning autism. So that's that. In this talk, I'm going to be talking specifically about the challenges of the condition that I've experienced and that the research says that most people with autism of my level experience. I think I'm going to do that because I think, particularly in the media, but also in academia and psychology, the pros of the condition are talked about a lot, which is great, and it's an overcorrection, but the frustrations and the challenges, which are amplified by our being within a finite world where most people don't have autism, are not really talked about enough, in my opinion. So that's what I'm going to focus on today. And they're going to set out what I see as the main challenges that people with autism of my level experience, this side of the eschaton, and how one might respond to them as a church and individually, and what practices we might adopt. So I think the first main challenge is systemic and entrenched loneliness. So people with autism are on average 4 times more likely to experience loneliness, and that's kind of a severe form of loneliness. And 79% of people with autism say that they feel socially isolated. In 2018, in England, only 5% of people with autism were married, compared with 50% of people that don't have the condition. And that's despite the desire for marriage being the same in the general population as it is with people with autism. So why might this be? Well, I think one of the reasons for that is the greater difficulty in, interpersonal relationships and communication and social intelligence, etc. Presumptive understanding, intuitive knowledge compared with inferential knowledge and interpretation of data. And so those factors obviously are amplified in things like dating or deep friendships and in interpersonal interactions in person. And yet this is an area where people with autism seem to be inherently hamstrung, just neurologically. And it's an area where, yes, there can be social adaptation, but I've tried to read books on emotional intelligence and etc., but my knowledge is never going to be as good as someone who doesn't have the condition because they will have it intuitively like that. It will just come straight to them. And so I think, yeah, all that is to say that there's only a certain level of social accommodation that can lower the hurdles, but it can't knock them over altogether, as it were. So as I say, there's been a big campaign, particularly since the 70s, in terms of trying to improve awareness, but also rights. And that's done a huge amount of great work from a very difficult sort of standing start. But I think one of the challenges is that it's sidelined the challenges of the condition, but also it's focused on rights and not relationships. And so it's not focused on what those rights are directed towards. So I might have the freedom as a person with autism under the Equality Act of 2010 to, associate freely, yada, yada, yada. But if no one wants to be my friend, then it's kind of tough luck. And so the freedoms have to be directed towards some good, as Augustine would say. So both friendships and dating tend to be particularly uphill struggles for people with autism, for the factors that I've talked about. And I think it's a situation whereby, it's been a rock and a hard place. There aren't really any easy answers because friendship is inevitably and rightly a gift and not a duty. I don't have a duty to be friends with anyone in particular. It's a freely chosen thing. And I think the other challenge on the friendship front is that people with autism will tend to have greater difficulty in living independently, with depression and anxiety and lots of different areas of their life. So they tend to be needier people on average. And so that means that they will depend on each friend more deeply. And so for the person who doesn't have autism, that can be quite draining and can make the friendship unbalanced and asymmetrical. And that's further demonstrated in the fact that when people that are parents and carers of people with autism are surveyed, they have a much higher rates of depression and anxiety. And so that's with all their kind of awareness and rights campaigns and all the rest of it. Yeah, it's just not affected that side of things. So that's that. I think another thing that's interesting to think about is what exactly we mean by loneliness. So there's a big difference between aloneness, so you know, I spend all day every day in my room and I don't see anyone, therefore I'm alone and therefore I'm lonely, and loneliness in the sense of a subjective sense of I'm in a room full of people, I don't feel like I can engage with the conversation, I don't think it's interesting, I don't feel a connection to people, I don't see why I'm here. If I left, no one would really suffer from that. And so, yeah, so there is a difference between objective and subjective loneliness, and that's particularly acute in people with autism. And because of that, they can tend to seem snobbish or elitist because they are socially selective, because they want to have friendships where they don't have to only talk about the weather or shoes, but can talk about Augustine and eschatology, for example. No, that's all. Although I did find it very difficult to talk to people at my college in Durham about celibacy and the Dead Fathers at lunch. It was a really painful time. But anyway, there you go. And then I think the next key challenge is the greater propensity to depression and anxiety. Obviously, there is a much more awareness and understanding and knowledge in this area, which is great, but there isn't a huge amount more of how exactly depression manifests itself in people with autism. It's a really interesting question, I think, because obviously the way in which depression is diagnosed is by examining what people say about their emotions. And the problem with a lot of people with autism is they don't really value emotions in the same way, they find them harder to understand, they can find them inconvenient, then they don't follow the rules of reason and the systems of dogma, and so they're very inconvenient things, you know. Why is it I've fallen in love with someone? Well, there's not really a reason, it's just something that happens. But why does it happen? And so it's a very frustrating situation. There's no kind of, but you know, but they have the wrong view on process theology. Like, how am I supposed to process that? And so, yes, so how are you supposed to diagnose the condition, never mind give the treatment? Is a very difficult thing. There's also a lack of awareness and understanding amongst GPs, for example, and on the condition and how it works for people with autism. And they didn't actually trial antidepressant medications or cognitive therapies on people with autism before they introduced them. And so it's an interesting disparity there. And again, it comes back to the problem, a problem of the fall. I'll be generous, I won't say it's a problem of creation, but a problem of the fall, which is that, you know, there's only 0.5% of the global population have autism. And so what that means is that it's very difficult in terms of resource allocation to justify, let's have mandatory training on how we respond to depression in people with autism, because actually, you know, only 1% of people have it, and so is it going to be worth the investment and the funding and the money? It's always quite a difficult debate there. And so the estimates for the co-occurrence of anxiety and depression in people with autism are as high as 85%. And so that just really shows the disparity between neurotypicals, people without the condition, and people with the condition. And people with autism are also 7 times more likely to commit suicide, and about twice, in terms of about 14 times more likely to attempt as well. So again, another disparity there. And so I think a lot of that is due to the fact, again, people can't diagnose the condition very well, and so it's not treated, and then when it is treated, it's treated as if you've just got depression, there's not something further below that. And so obviously add to that all the sensory overload, the social exhaustion that people with autism feel after extended conversations, etc., and the isolating nature of the condition. And you can start to see why that disparity might be there. So only 14% of UK adults with autism said that their local mental health arrangements were sufficient, and they did receive sufficient support. And only 30% said they had sufficient time to prepare for the transition to adulthood. And 75% of people with autism still in adulthood still live with their parents. And so you can start to see some of the kind of, you know, despite all the social awareness and the improving treatment understanding, etc., it's not really a problem to be solved. It's a mystery to be experienced. It's a suffering to be alleviated. You can never really reduce it entirely. So, and then also on the employment front, and in 2020, only 22% of adults with autism were employed in any way, and sort of half of that were in full-time employment. So again, that shows some of the systemic barriers there. It's interesting because in the field of IT, they are really trying to, because they know that people with autism are more likely to be good at IT, and so they are trying to lower some of the barriers there and interview people in sort of more autistic-friendly ways by having specially dedicated days for them. Like at university, you might go a few days early to kind of adjust yourself to the situation. I think the third and final major problem that I'd like to talk about in people with autism is obsessive internet usage, which ties in with and is arguably caused by the loneliness and the isolation and depression, etc. So obviously most people with autism use the internet more regularly and for longer periods. It's largely to indulge their obsessive interests, and also it's because you can communicate with people on the internet that are around the world that share your condition, because there might not be local people that have it, and you don't have to worry about whether or not your body language is expressing the right thing, or whether or not you're vibing with someone, or whatever it might be described as, or what your facial expression might be, or yes, and so and also I think that sometimes there can be a correlation with gaming as well, and addiction to social media, things like that. But that tendency is frustrating because it ties into people then avoiding or lessening the amount of time they spend engaging with people in person. And so it's a negative cycle, because the less time you spend with people in person, the more obsessed with the internet you are, the more obsessed with the internet you are, the less your social skills develop, the less likely you are to get in the world in full employment and living independently, etc. Again, another systemic problem which has not been resolved by the social adaptation. So that's that one. So in the research that I did in my dissertation, I looked at these kind of entrenched challenges, and I thought, obviously there is a trend that these things are improving, but they are ultimately insurmountable hurdles. And so how, as Christians and as a church, do we respond to that? And I think the main way, and it's only one way, is the practice of lament, and to say that yes, there are advantages of the condition of autism, and the average person with autism has a higher IQ, they tend to be more skilled in the fields of academia and music, etc. But there are advantages that can't just be fast-forwarded over or ignored. And so I found the practice of lament quite helpful in being able to express frustration and grievance and complaint to God while still believing in him and knowing that he hears, and that even if we're not getting a direct reply, we are able to leave a message on the answer phone, as it were. So I'm not going to talk more about lament for the moment unless we have a dearth of questions, just because I'll be preaching it on Friday, and also because I think a lot of people are more familiar with it due to the pandemic and teaching on courses, etc. So I'm going to skip over that for a minute, but I can come back to it if people are interested, because I want to come to the final part, which is about the way in which people with autism do or don't believe, and how they do or don't engage in worship, and how that's different, because I think that is, so it's more, hopefully might be more relevant to the ways in which you'll be ministering in the future. So the question becomes, as I put in the email, are autistic Christians just awkward contrarians? Are they just disagreeing for the sake of it? Are they just being deliberately difficult? Why can't they just go along with that, the arm raising or whatever it is? And my response is, I certainly don't think they're just awkward contrarians. I think if you're eccentric, you don't have to be autistic, but it does help. But I would say that one of the frustrations of my experience is that people say, well, why can't you just go along with the fact that we're using Eucharistic prayer A or whatever it is? And for me, obviously, there's a logical battle to be had there, whereas other people, it's like, just experience something different or try something new or experiment or whatever. And so from my point of view, I'm not being difficult. It's just that the way my brain works is different. And so I'm not going to kind of surrender that. So that's the way I would see that. But anyway, so I think one of the challenges is how, as people with autism who have brains that work very differently to the average person, do we experience the indwelling of the Holy Spirit? And do we engage in worship with our hearts and souls as well as our minds? A friend of mine wrote a book which says that she wants to love God with all her mind, but as an autistic Christian, her mind works differently, and so that love is going to express itself in different ways. So even if an autistic person struggles to conceptualize God, which they often do due to the fact that the way they conceive of people and the way they conceive of systems and categories and attributes is different, they can still feel a sense of awe and wonder and still praise God in different but equal ways. And the question becomes, how do you accommodate that, even though there's a minority of people in a congregation that will have the condition? I don't think there's an answer to that, but I think it's an interesting question and an important question to be pondered. So to have a relationship with God, one must be able to empathise with God's personality traits, must be able to try and have an understanding of his moods and his ways of communicating. But people with autism have a difficult enough time doing that with someone that is right in front of them, never mind with someone that's immortal, invisible, God only wise. And so how is that going to work? Well, yeah, it's a difficult one. And in my time, some people have said that I'm not a Christian because my perception of these things is so different from the average person. And I understand that to a degree. And there's a degree to which I wouldn't be interested in the field had I not been diagnosed with a condition. But this is where I think awareness is really helpful. So anyway, I think the argument would be that intellectual activity is just as human and natural an activity as emotional activity. And so people with autism, often they will still be emotional beings, but their emotion will be impacted and will grow out of their reason. So they're not divorced or polar opposites, which arguably could be said to be a bit more of the case with the average person. And so statistically speaking, and this is, I think, the interesting thing, people with autism are much, much more likely to be non-Christians. From a cognitive science point of view, that's been demonstrated by lots of different studies. And so how do we deal with that? How do we understand that? And how does the church respond? Because, yeah, it's literally, they're twice as likely to be non-Christians. And even the ones that are Christians are more likely to not believe in God as a personal being. So for me, the way that works out is I don't understand when someone says to me, I have a personal relationship with Jesus. To me, that's like saying, I toasted some jelly yesterday. It just doesn't really work as an idea. It's just bizarre to me. It's a bit like if you were to say to someone who's Roman Catholic or Orthodox, as someone said to me at university, I have a daily cup of tea with Jesus. Just look at you in total bafflement. And that's the kind of situation that I find myself in. And so in charismatic circles, it can be a little more challenging. But again, for me, that's a situation where I think it's great that you can have your cup of tea with Jesus. But don't expect me to understand that, because I'm sorry I don't. And equally, you may think, why is this guy interested in Bonaventure? And I can't really explain it. But I just have. Anyway. So that's that. So, and then we come on to, because of that, The way in which a lot of thinkers who have autism, I've tried to conceptualise that, is looking at the lens of the hiddenness of God. So has anyone heard of this idea? Nobody? Wow, okay. So it's the idea that God sometimes hides himself from us, as we read in Isaiah 45:15. Truly thou art a God who hidest himself. And that there are ways in which God's presence isn't always apparent. And so that is built in, if you like, to the autistic's experience. So I have had one religious experience, but equally I've had lots of times, at New Wine, for example, where I have felt a little bit like a mute statue. I don't really know what I'm doing there and how my presence is being valued, because I don't feel the same connection as the people around me seem to be doing. And now, in that situation, I'm not saying that their connection is false or irrelevant or not helpful. I'm just saying that I can't experience that. And so I'm not going to be as comfortable in that setting as in 8 a.m. BCP communion. And so, so again, awareness is key. So, what else would I say? Often people with autism would characterise themselves as being religious but not spiritual. So the other way around from the way in which a lot of atheists in our society would be spiritual but not religious, because they like the rigidity and the structure and the predictability and the rituals and the liturgy and the routine and etc. But they don't like the kind of this nebulous spirituality, centered or centering or centered prayer or whatever it is, and these kind of ideas of contemplation and for us, theology is the road to holiness. Theology is prayer. They're not separate activities. One doesn't come after the other. It is the same thing, worship through the way you study God and enter into his glory and majesty. And so, for me, I can say the creeds without having my fingers crossed or anything like that. Not because I'm in a personal relationship with Jesus, but because I've read Irenaeus. And so it's a different way of computing. Because the way my faith operates is much more systematic and propositional, someone said to me, why do you believe that Pontius Pilate was responsible for Jesus' death or whatever? Because it's in the creed. It's not because of an emotional connection or because of lots of research, but it's a situation where for me faith is a system that I engage with. It's not primarily about feeling a loving touch of Jesus or whatever. So that's the way it kind of works for me. What else have I got to say? So people with autism can prefer to pray in a way that is structured in terms of having things to be thankful for God for, things to praise him for, and having it sort of sectioned systematically. And that's why the device of lament is quite helpful, having a grievance stage, a complaint stage, a petition stage where they ask God for something, and a praise stage, because it splits it up into a system and makes it into discrete sections. A final thing to say, I suppose, is that a lot of people with autism, not necessarily all people with autism, but a lot of people with autism have difficulties in following, you might have noticed this perhaps from me, in following commands without a rationale behind them, or without having a rationale presented to them. So that's sometimes called as oppositional defiance disorder or pathological defiance disorder, or things like that. And so if I'm asked to read my Bible every day, for example, and someone doesn't say why, there's going to be a challenge. Whereas someone says, well, you can grow in holiness in this particular way, and you couldn't do that from reading Bonaventure, or whatever, or it forces you to read passages that might be difficult for you, then I'm much more willing to, and likely, to follow the command than if it's just given to me. And so sometimes, I think particularly in evangelical churches, there can be more of a tendency to say, here's a list of things you should do them, rather than here's a list of things you can do, and here's why that will be helpful or uplifting, etc. So that's something to be aware of in pastoral ministry and worship and discipleship.
Sorry, can you name the condition again?
So it's known variously as pathological demand avoidance, which I think is a slightly derogatory term, and oppositional defiance disorder.
You're also phasing those terms out.
Yeah, I know, but
There's lots of contention around them, at least, largely because of the way you come to a diagnosis of them and try and formalise something that is a bit subjective. Sorry, something.
Yeah. No, it's helpful. It's helpful.
Still-
Well, it's a helpful observation. I don't think that the point is helpful in the sense that, like, I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to use the word "the" in a minute, because it seems they're ruling out so many different words, and I can't say that I have high functioning autism, even though that's what I was diagnosed with. Anyway.
Do you think there's going to be a frustration for yourself or for others with autism in terms of the way that we're being told we should talk about people with autism?
Yes, very much so. Yes.
So how do we be more aware of that? Is it a case of asking people with autism what they?
I think so. Yeah, it's a bit like the whole activist versus, so like a lot of people that are in the disability rights movement don't have any disabilities. It's a little bit patronising. And so, like, for example, they did a big study and they found that actually, so they in academic psychology they banned the term autistic person, right, or using autistic as an adjective. Which basically just means you have to add an extra 1,000 words to your dissertation because you're going to say person with autism every time. But anyway, the frustration was that actually, when they asked people in a massive survey that had autism, 70% said, I prefer the term autistic person. And so often these changes are due to kind of perceived political correctness of people that don't even have the condition themselves. And so it's being imposed. And so anyway, I think that's a problem. And then the final thing I'd say, which is kind of linked, is that often people with autism have what might be called Socratic minds. So they're always questioning things, and they're taught to. It's almost like they're encultured to question everything, and that can be very draining and tiring and frustrating, not for themselves but for everyone else. And it's something to be aware of. And to encourage patience with. And so I suppose a final note before the session becomes a little bit more interesting is to say that one thing I would like to encourage in a positive sense is more, obviously, awareness, understanding, all the cliches, but more than that, more patience and understanding that this whole faith thing is going to work very differently for people with autism. And in many ways, it's a miracle of grace that they are Christians or in our church at all, given the statistics that neurologically much less likely to believe anyway. And so not trying to be too demanding, but equally not pandering either. And so I'd like to draw that balance. There you go. Thank you for listening. If anyone needs to dash off, please. If anyone needs to dash off, please do. If you'd like to ask any questions, that's fine. I will be sending out the notes and the resources and the clip. Feel free to kick off the questions if there are any.
Conscious that it can be very common with